In this video, I'll discuss classes and their purpose in object-oriented software development. In object-oriented programming, we create objects, which are groups of code or data structures designed to contain variables and procedures. The way classes are used doesn't really vary from programming language to programming language, so classes in Kotlin aren't much different, although it's worth mentioning that everything in Kotlin is an object. Classes have a class declaration, that is the portion of code that defines the class. And a class contains the name, the header, and body, which is the contained code. We use the class keyword to define classes. So here are two basic examples. In the first, we use a similar structure to other languages like Java, where braces contain the code that defines a class, in this example represented by the ellipses. But we can also declare a class in Kotlin using the simpler format that just names the class. This would only be used if there was no defining body for the class, so its usage is limited because it doesn't actually define any parameters, variables, or functions for the class. Classes in Kotlin can have constructors, which are subroutines designed to create a specific instance of a class. In other words, constructors create objects. For example, if you had a class called fruit, you could construct it to create a unique instance of that class called apple. They also have properties. For example, an apple can be round, red, a Macintosh, and so on. They can have functions, just like the functions you create in any programming language. So, for example, in your class called fruit, you could have a function that calculates the cost of a dozen. Initializer blocks are pieces of code that initialize a class. Object declarations are code that creates duplicate objects, usually with minor changes to a class. And you can also nest classes inside other classes and create inner classes, which are similar to nested, but allow the inner class to access references to the classes they're nested in. Constructors are used to create specific instances of classes. Classes in Kotlin can have a primary constructor and one or more secondary constructors. So, for example, here we have examples of a primary constructor, and note the use of the word constructor in bold. That's a primary constructor. The second example is an example of a secondary constructor where the constructor is contained within the braces that encase the class. Initializer blocks are defined using the init keyword and are simple pieces of code that initialize a class. For example, here we've got a class called fruit, and it contains an initializer block that displays the fruit type. Finally, there's the process of creating instances. It's one thing to declare a class, but you actually have to use it. And that's where instances come in. So here we've got two examples of how instances are created. If you're familiar with other object-oriented programming languages like Java, note that there's no new keyword